opening the webinar. People are now beginning to join us.
2 minutes to go.
Yes. I think we can begin anyway. I'm showing less than a minute, actually. So welcome, everyone. This is a Boundary 2 special webinar on the topic of book editing. And welcome today. We have 4 very distinguished colleagues, stars in the field of academic book editing. I will introduce them all and speak about them for a few minutes in a moment. We decided today that we wanted to address the intellectual function of the book editor and the book publisher. Not so much immediately the first and obvious topic, which is what is the sociological function of book publishing and book editing. We've understood editors are, of course, intellectuals, just like so many other people. They have desires, they have goals, they have purposes, they have ways of working, skills, which they hone and develop. It's time to think about those skills and to think about how using those skills impacts the way in which knowledge is produced and distributed, how choices are made by university publishers and editors to help advance work in some areas as opposed to perhaps others, and also how to keep intellectual work in tune both with progress in the disciplines and with the obligations that a larger society imposes upon its principal institutions. So those are some of the topics. There will be many others, which I think we have a chance to talk about today. Let me begin by saying a few things about our guests. Hosting our session is Lindsay Waters, who has just stepped down, just retired from Harvard University Press, where he was the longtime executive editor for the Humanities. Lindsay has also been for about 20 years now an advisory editor on the masthead of the journal Boundary 2. Lindsey Bann, his career, as probably some of you know, as a medievalist at the University of Chicago, where he took his dissertation, wrote his dissertation on a 15th century poet, Luigi Pulci, someone I must confess I haven't yet read. He became famous editorially first as at the University of Minnesota, where he was the founding editor of the Theory and History of Literature series, which began in '81 and continued until 1998. And for those people in the academy who were moved by the effect of the theory movement, that series was one of the most consequential things in academic publishing in its time. It translated into English, often for the first time, such people as Agamben, Cixous, Deleuze, and so on. Right now, the Minnesota website, Doug Armato is here and he'll recognize this, I suppose, but the Minnesota website still says that the THL series undeniably and indelibly changed the intellectual landscape of the late 20th century and helped establish the University of Minnesota Press as a premier publisher of literary and cultural theory and intellectual thought. When Waters moved from Minnesota to Harvard, where he became the executive editor for the Humanities, he became a kind of a generalist. He remained there until he retired at the end of last year. He's perhaps most famous for having promoted a major list in analytic philosophy there, developing the work in the traditions of Putnam and Cavell. He also created and established a list of what he called new literary histories of national literatures, beginning with France and progressing through an important volume on US literature and culture, and ending just before his retirement with a big volume on Chinese literature. In terms of my work and my interests, most importantly, he edited and curated the HUP multi-volume edition of Walter Benjamin in English. He's published 2 books, Against Authoritarian Aesthetics, Towards a Poetics of Experience, which exists also in Chinese. In 2004, he published a small volume with Prickly Paradigm Press called Enemies of Promise, which has been translated into Chinese, Portuguese, French, and Polish, and which the MLA report of 2007 on the tyranny of the monograph in academia cites as an important influence on their revisions of the understanding of the importance of the monograph. He's continued to publish articles on publishing itself, on the humanities, on criticism, in such places as the Chronicle of Higher Education, Boundary 2, where he writes for us on criticism and aesthetics. And in retirement, you'll be pleased to know he's writing 2 books, one on his own aesthetic education, as he calls it, and another, the memoir as a career as an editor. Also with us today is Doug Armato, director of the University of Minnesota Press since '98. Excuse me. He came to Minnesota after a term as associate director of the book division at the Hopkins Press. He was president of the Association of University Presses. And in 2000, working with Steve Cohn at Duke University Press, who was recently retired, I believe, and Susan Schott at Kansas, contributed a volume, The Value of University Presses, which remains a kind of touchstone for the discussions in the field. I'll try to remember to put some links in the chat to these documents. He's been a major theorist in thinking about the development of ebook publication. He has given us articles on publishing, editing, on new technologies, things which appear in Inside Higher Ed, and interestingly to me on the website of Progressive Geographies, as well as on several major press blogs, where he writes on the value of academic presses, the challenges faced by funding at those presses, new technologies, and also the opportunities they provide. With his co-principal investigator, Matthew Gold, Doug has established at the Minnesota Press the Manifold Scholarship Platform, which produces and distributes knowledge beyond the traditional monograph form. He acquires books in translation, social political theory, and he is the in-house editor for the Post-Humanities series. His politics are so broad as to almost exhaust enumeration. Biopolitics, he lists these as some of his interests: biopolitics, eco-criticism, speculative realism, animal studies, consumerism, utopianism, cosmology, nonlinear thought, materialism, technology, and the history and practice of theory, etc. But in keeping with his effort to rethink the monogram, he is also promoting books that follow an essayistic or speculative rather than traditional monographic structure. Thanks, Doug, for coming, and welcome. Also with us is Philip Leventhal, who is senior editor at Columbia University Press, where he is responsible for journalism, film studies, and English and comparative literature. He curates several series for the Columbia Press: the Columbia Journalism Review of Books series, the Film and Culture series, Literature Now, and a series which I know fairly well in my own areas of interest, the Modernist Latitude series. Some of the important books that have come out recently under Philip's guidance have been on creative writing, The Late Age of Print, The Greatest Grid, which I recommend, and The Watchdog That Didn't Bark, which is part of the journalistic work that he helps to curate in relation to the journalism school at Columbia. Before becoming editor at Columbia, he was in the marketing department. Lindsay Waters told me he thought, Philip, that you had once worked in the seminary co-op bookstore. I'm not sure if that's true.
Is that correct?
That is true. Yeah, I'll talk
true.
about that a little bit. Yeah, I mean,
Good,
that was a really important part, I think, of my approach to University Press publishing.
Yeah, someone who knows how bookstores work would be very useful to all of us. One of his tasks, I think, as he sees it, is to convert dissertations into books. He's clearly thought a great deal about that and spoken of it. He has helped us understand that the converted dissertation is, however, a smaller percentage of the books published than it used to be, narrowing thereby the market for dissertations. I recommend, and again, I will try to put this in the chat, his essay, How to Turn Your Dissertation into a Book. There's a terrific short interview with him from the CUNY Grad Center on these matters from SoundCloud. I will again try to give you a link on that. In 2015-16, he was on the AAUP Acquisitions Editorial Committee, and as such, he produced the AAUP Handbook for Best Practices for Peer Review. It's interesting to me as I go through your biographies, unlike some of our academic colleagues, how intimately involved you are in the materialities of book production as opposed to simply the intellectual substance of the process. Philip has played a major role in improving scholars' understanding of publishing and the roles played by university presses. He's addressed the question of the value of peer review, and he's done that in part by serving on the faculty outreach committee of the AAUP. Welcome, Philip. Thanks again for coming. And last, alphabetically as it were, is Anne Savarese, who is now the executive editor for literature at Princeton University Press, where she acquires books about literature, including, I'm glad to hear, literary criticism and literary history. I have the feeling you must have had something to do with the big Dante biography, which I've enjoyed enormously. She also has brought out primary and biographical work. The example she often gives is the living on paper, the letters from Iris Murdoch. She's been involved in the new translations and editions of classics, including the fairy tales of Brothers Grimm. She acquires in modern British and American literary poetry and poetics, folklore, language, and media history. The interest in media history is important to me. In particular, I recommend a book by a former Boundary 2 colleague and friend, edited by Tony Grafton, called Information, a Historical Companion. Anne is interested in books that put literature into relation with other subjects, such as intellectual and cultural and social history, and interested in the relation between literature and the visual arts, which is something I just published a book about. She acquires poetry for 2 series in the Lockhart Library of Poetry and Translation, where the faculty editors are Peter Cole, Richard Seaberth, and Rosanna Warren. The series, I think, that was previously guided by Richard Howard. Recently, there's volumes by the great Greek poet Yanis Ritsos, Stephanie Burke's rendering after Callimachus, and Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi's the translation of Desire. My Arabic accent is not always great. And with Susan Stewart as the faculty editor, she edits the Princeton series of contemporary poets. And translation, I was very pleased to see the work on Billy Wilder's essays, which were done by Shelley Frisch, whom I know primarily as the translator of Rainer Stock's biography, 3-volume biography of Kafka. So anyway, welcome to all of you. Thank you. I'm going to step away as much as I can. And Lindsay, perhaps you can begin for us.
Am I audible? I think so. There's Michel Serre. What's he doing over there? Okay, so, and Paul, I have what, how many minutes? 5, 10? Paul? Oh, he did.
10.
He did step away. Oh, okay.
No, I'm not away. I said 10.
You come back in an hour. I'm still going. Okay. And I'm going to look at the questions that we sort of talked about as things that, I mean, all of us got this set of questions, I think. What an editor should do, what sort of intellectual life an editor must lead to be effective, and to achieve desired ends, etc. Okay, I think I'm going to start then answering these questions as best I can, and it may seem disjointed. It will seem disjointed. I just assembled it. Okay, I was going to say, and if it looks like I'm risking losing my time, speed me up. Okay, I was going to say, Minnesota for me was a great place to start doing what I was doing. And it was a press that was actually, like, it was famous for the Doctors of Mayo. The director of the University of Minnesota Press was a woman named Helen Clavesaddle. I never met her, but she must have been a formidable character. And she was actually married to the person who was the director of the University of Chicago Press, Roger Shug. Also at the University of Minnesota Press was something which became very important to me as a model. It was called the American. Minnesota had probably the best English department in the country until Yale kind of took the lead. But Minnesota was great in the 40s and 50s. And there were some very active people in publishing there was in particular a guy named William Van O'Connor, who started the American Writers Pamphlet series. And Doug can tell you that, I mean, when I left the press, it sold 2.3 million units. And in a way, it was the model that I used for developing my new history of French literature, new history of German literature, American literature, and Chinese literature. The idea that each contributor would be limited to work within a certain space. Each of those Minnesota pamphlets was 48 pages long, and each of the entries for my new literary histories had to be 10 manuscript pages in length. And those texts, the Minnesota series, the pamphlets had to be readable. They didn't have, they might not have had any footnotes. They could be written by creative writers. And in fact, the most recent of my literary histories is the Chinese one. And the editor of that volume, David Wong, and the board took very seriously what the people did at Minnesota and what I thought they did at Minnesota. And there are at least 6 entries of the 200 entries in the history of Chinese literature edited by David Wong that are by creative writers. There's the novelist Ha Jin writes an entry on when Lu Xun first began to write and his decision. But some of the entries are actually entirely fictional. And it's this has been, I think, liked and enjoyed and approved by the people who've written reviews of this book. So that the Minnesota series, Minnesota got me going, and it's stayed with me until today. In my career, the way I think of it is the way I was thinking about it, thinking about talking today, was my goal was always to solve intellectual problems. So there was the question of, since I was trained at Chicago with intensely within the Aristotelian, neo-Aristotelian theory line. So, and what I did in theory at Minnesota and then have continued at Harvard is really a continuation of what I began doing as a graduate student and what other people were doing at the University of Chicago. So the big problem, an intellectual problem that I had coming out of graduate school is, how do I bring together my concern for unity, which I've been schooled in by the neo-Aristotelians, with the multiplicity of the literary practice of modern artists, such as Byron, on whom I did part of my dissertation, James Joyce, Rabelais. My dissertation was on Pulci's Morgante Maggiore and Byron's Don Juan. There's no way that any Aristotelian University of Chicago theoretical take on these works would make sense of that. Though I had teachers at the University of Chicago, like Sheldon Sachs, who's the guy who started critical inquiry, who said, if we just work at it hard enough, we're going to figure out what the Aristotelian explanation is of even Don Juan and of Rabelais. But I'm not sure he's right about that. Okay, another factor for me, and I'm not looking at my clock. How many minutes do I have? 3? 5. Another important factor for me that I didn't realize how important it was going to get to be was my Catholic education. I went to Catholic grade schools, high schools, Catholic college, and then some people think the University of Chicago is also a Catholic school where Protestants go to learn about Catholic theology from Jews. That's the University of Chicago. The Catholic education, and it's kind of become more important as time has gone by for me. There's some of you may know the work of the Pixies and Frank Black and the Catholics, and there's a song by Frank Black called "Back to Rome," and it seems somehow that I am going back to Rome. And I've been driven back to Rome and back to the question of, where does criticism begin? And I've been in love with both artworks and criticism. So I'm interested in finding scholars who can write with verve the way Pauline Kael can write, the way Greil Marcus can write. And sometimes if I publish rock critics along with specialists on Jane Austen, it's to try to push the scholars to write better. So that's no wonder that I published this book called which is called by some people the Rolling Stone History of American Literature. It's a book edited by Greil Marcus and Werner Solers, and that I think everything in that book, just like every one of the pamphlets from the University of Minnesota Press, is readable. Is readable by human beings. So I was born right between Aristotle and Elvis Presley, between Rome and Chicago, between elite culture and pop culture. I'm coming to a conclusion relatively soon. Between Aristotle and Greil Marcus, it leads to Tony Grafton. And it was Greil Marcus who wrote The Dustbin of History, but I once had Greil Marcus write, no, I had Tony Grafton write a reader's report. There are wonderful things you can do in university publishing. It's just so great. I could get Tony Grafton to review a book by Greil Marcus, or Greil Marcus to review for the Syndics. And these are smart people, so they write reviews that work with our board of Syndics. So between Dustbin of History and Sticky Fingers, it's always been a case of being educated in snobbery. I had 7 sisters. I was raised on a pig farm, but in our farmhouse, we had stacks and stacks of not the Partisan Review, but of the Farm Journal and Vogue and Mademoiselle. So the question is, how can you keep up your standards and can you keep judging and hunting for things and be a total snob when you have to feed the pigs in the morning and at night? It's a challenge, but it's the challenge that I was raised in. So there's a bias towards books that have to do with the women's conditions, such as Catherine McKinnon. There was Harvard Press was already working on women's issues. When I joined the press, it was right when Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice had been published. So in sum, I was always using my publishing to solve intellectual, aesthetic, and philosophical problems that preoccupied me. I made it sound very selfish. But you kind of don't get things done if you don't have a strong desire to do them for yourself, and hope that other people could be interested. Jesuits, Catholics, Frank Black and the Pixies. Working on the Jesuits led me to, the very first book I did at the Harvard Press was The First Jesuits by John O'Malley. I had no intention of publishing books about religion, but religion began to be more. Then I ended up publishing 5 or 6 books by John O'Malley. He's got lots of frequent flyer miles, as many as one of my most wonderful authors was a professor at Minnesota named Carol Ann Marling, also had many, many frequent flyer miles. And books coming out from Harvard for me. I have a book on spiritual exercises by Hint de Vries coming out. I have a book by a historian named Sarah Shortall called Soldiers of God in a Secular World. I think there's some things this is what I'm offering for discussion. There's more.
Thanks, Lindsay. Since we agreed to go alphabetically from there, Doug, would you like to take over for us?
I'd be happy to. I don't think I can match Lindsay's exuberance because it's one of the great things about, having known Lindsay for all of these years and inherited so much of his mantle at Minnesota. But Paul, in his very kind introduction, mentioned my interest in sort of the intersections of book publishing and digital media. So I want to talk a little bit about, or at least begin by speculating a bit on how the digital has impacted editorial practice. And I'll do that somewhat obliquely because I often work that way. So in the Albanian novelist Ismail Kaderi's 1980 novel, The Palace of Dreams, spies lurk in the corners of taverns, coffee shops, town plazas, parties, and other gathering places in order to overhear people talk of the dreams they had the night before, and then report them to a central agency where they're analyzed and correlated with other overheard dreams for the indications they may provide about events and attitudes that will emerge from the subconscious to action and tangible reality. Kaderi's vision of a surveillance bureau for the unformed, still emerging impulses and desires revealed in a network of dreams is a fair approximation of the University Press acquisition editor's practice in the era of digital culture. We are increasingly in a position of tracking scholarly ideas as they emerge and take shape, correlating them with other emerging concepts, seeing them shared or challenged, and monitoring them as they coalesce into tangible form. Somewhat akin to William Gibson's famous definition of cyberspace as a collective hallucination, the emerging scholarly spaces on the web, including individual and collective blogs, and scholarly use of commercial spaces such as Twitter and Facebook, and other online traces such as syllabi, CVs, conference programs, and open access journal articles, become for the university press editor a kind of collective scholarly becoming. As scholarly communication, as distinct from scholarly publishing, pursues its day-to-day life via this informal digital media, editors are in a position to track scholarly ideas as they emerge and take shape, correlating them with other emerging concepts, seeing them shared or challenged, and monitoring them as they coalesce into tangible form. We see scholarly projects emerge serially from the larval stages of Twitter and Facebook through the chrysalis of blog posts and conference papers. And unlike the other earlier forms of editorial sleuthing, we can simultaneously obtain a sense of reception and audience, the extent of an author's network, and even the author's aspirations. The editors with whom I work are constantly sending each other links to traces of projects, many at very early stages. We also discover books that are unaccountably out of print and indications of authors who need to be translated online. To use another William Gibson concept, the scholarly acquisition editor's work is increasingly that of pattern recognition and not the mere bureaucracy of peer review that some imagine. As you'll gather, I see scholarly editing not as taking place within the major disciplines, much less in submissions from literary agents, but in the interstices between established areas and in the intellectual disconnect with them. Sometimes accused of rushing to trendy areas of scholarship, university presses, when they are at their best, provide an alternate locus of accreditation for emerging areas of scholarship and scholarly method, and by working across institutional boundaries, help correct for localized pockets of conservatism. As universities address their continuing budget crises by combining departments, shuttering interdisciplinary centers, tightening tenure opportunities, university press imprints are even more important as a validation of innovative and boundary challenging work. And we have a commercial motivation in this as well. With the senescence of academic libraries, which today account for at most a quarter of university press book sales, and their outsourcing of selection functions to corporate vendors, the only scholarly books that get attention and succeed in the marketplace are those that are intellectually ambitious, that innovate, and that take chances. I've had occasion to think about this even more recently while working with a young scholar, Abram Foley, on his forthcoming book, The Editor Function, which recognizes how book editing, publishing, and distribution themselves have a poetics and play an active part in shaping how we think about the literary field, doing so through a close study of avant-garde enterprises, including Dalkey Archive, Fiction Collective 2, Semiotext, and the irregular magazine Hambone. Following Michel Foucault's famous delineation of the author function, Foley suggests that non-corporate publishers work against the editor function of mainstream presses by promoting radical alternatives to the mainstream through non-industrialized, anti-quantitative practices that include correspondence, judgment, friendship, and rivalry formation, to which I'd add reading, curiosity, hunches, risk-taking, and trust. Foley posits that independent publishers play indeed a theoretical role in critiquing the post-war publishing industrial complex, which I'd extend to the academic industrial complex, and thus seek to attain escape from a stultified culture. Scholarly editors shape the direction of knowledge, present and future. The Polish science fiction writer Stanislaw Lem posed in his 1976 philosophical work Summa Technologiae the problem of peak information, the human inability to process the information it creates. Lem writes, what will happen to a civilization that does not manage to overcome its information crisis? It will become transformed from one that studies everything, as ours does at the moment, into one that only focuses on a select few directions. With each one of those directions gradually beginning to experience the lack of resources, their number will steadily decrease. As Lem projects, without management, without gatekeeping, information will lose its vitality. Superfluidity, overabundance only leads to crisis. Information needs to be managed, regulated, constrained, selected is what we'll be talking about today, or it will decline and face a kind of extinction in an apocalyptic battle of the disciplines, the precursor of which is the STEM versus humanities divide we see in today's academy. In that context, publication by a university press means something academically, but also economically. It is both an evaluative process of peer review and faculty board approval, and an evaluating in terms of the press's decision to invest financial and personal resources in a particular project. At a time when the humanities and social sciences are being devalued within the academy, formal book publication signals that such works have an economic worth, that they have readers, and are more than what is sometimes deflatingly called academic work product. Thanks.
Nice.
Thanks, Doug. That was terrific and on time. Thank you for that. Philip, can we turn to you now?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
I think, some of what Doug said, and he's said it much better than I will. There'll be some repetition there, but that was really great. And, thanks so much for the invitation to participate in this discussion. It's a real honor to be sharing the screen with editors who publish books that I very much admire and who have developed such distinct and important lists in the humanities. I think most of what I have to say has to do more with sort of the material, sort of day-to-day aspects of what an editor does. And it's really nice to have this opportunity to have a conversation about what it is a university press editor actually do and how we think about our work and the balancing all of us are required to do as we address various intellectual and practical concerns and publish books that serve different communities and aims. As editors, we are charged with publishing books that further critical, scholarly, and intellectual discussions, but also we need to do that in a financially viable way. This often requires striking a balance between books aimed primarily at scholars focused on particular debates or concerns, and those that we consider trade books, that are aimed at readers outside the academy or potentially of interest to readers across different fields. Ideally, these two pursuits will coalesce, but often that's not the case. The timing of this panel is also very fortuitous, as I found that the rupture of normal rhythms of work life over the last year has made me see different elements of my work in a new light. And it's good to have this opportunity to perhaps rethink familiar routines and approaches to how we do our work. I like to think university presses, and by extension, university press editors, do have a meaningful role to play in the intellectual life of the university and the broader culture by publishing books, by publishing the books we do, but also having a kind of ongoing conversations we have with authors and scholars and thinking about how their ideas can be conveyed to readers and a broader public. This aspect of our work is perhaps sometimes overshadowed by the more functional elements of what we do in terms of managing the peer review process, the role books play in the tenure and promotion process, and the production and distribution of books by scholars and publishers. First of all, I'd like to say, I love being a university press editor. It's intellectually, it's a very rewarding job. I get to work with great colleagues, both at Columbia University Press and the university press community more broadly, and of course with the authors, series editors, and scholars who I engage with on a regular basis. Moreover, while there are some dark clouds on the horizon, particularly when it comes to the future of the humanities, I remain relatively optimistic about book publishing in the humanities, given the strong, creative, and ambitious work coming out in the fields I work in. I'm also encouraged by what I see as a new kind of flexibility in the kind of writing deemed appropriate for university press and who these works should try and reach. I think university press editors should help nurture this expansion of approaches and potential readers in the years to come, while still retaining our traditional and important role of publishing books that champion exciting new ideas and arguments in the fields we work in. As was discussed earlier, my first job in scholarly book world was at the Seminary Co-op bookstore in Chicago. And then I worked at the marketing department at Columbia University Press. I was very glad to have these opportunities. And both these positions gave me a good idea, a good sense of the ways in which books contribute to and can start new conversations within various fields and communities. In many ways, I see the role of the University Press editor as helping to facilitate these conversations and working with authors and series editors to define the parameters of debate and approaches in the field. As a University Press editor, keeping on top of ongoing and shifting conversations in the field is crucial. And this has definitely been one of the challenges over the past few months. In general, I try and keep tabs on new working conversations by keeping up with certain journals in the fields I work in. Likewise, and increasingly so, I find myself looking to more public-facing publications like Public Books, LA Review Books, or N+1, as those publications, introduce me to new and often younger scholars who might not be on my radar. They also help to bring ideas and conversations percolating in a specific field to a new set of readers outside of a particular discipline, or even outside of the academy. At the same time, these essays are often informed by conversations in the academy and offer a kind of bridge among different disciplines and to readers outside of the academy. In many ways, I've come to look at these venues as providing a model for a kind of publishing in the humanities that universities can and probably will need to do more of in the coming years. Of course, I'm relying on the scholars and authors who I am in discussion with and the people at Columbia. And, the peer review process is also crucial to the kind of work that I do. And having a network of contacts is important to a university press editor, but it's also crucial to keep expanding this network and seek out new voices and perspectives. Speaking for myself, this is something I need to actually get better at, both in terms of demographic diversity, as well as those who might be pursuing a career outside the normal tenure track way of doing things, particularly due to shifts in the current job market. Keeping up with trends is both necessary and energizing for me as an editor, but it's also important to avoid chasing trends in your publishing program. As things change and the relatively slow pace of university press publishing makes it necessary to locate those authors with ideas, arguments, and approaches that you think and hope provide a kind of intellectual and methodological framework that will have a staying power over the years and generate other kinds of work. Needless to say, this does not always happen, and not every book is a home run, but based on your conversations with the author, the peer review process, and your colleagues at the press in both editorial and marketing, you make your best effort to have those successful books and then to learn from your mistakes as well. I would also add, and I think this has been talked about a little bit, it's not only the strength and originality of the argument or the topic of the book that will determine the success, but I think increasingly too, what the author's ongoing engagement with their audience, whether it be scholars or a general public, and their ability to reach that audience plays a big role in a book's success. In terms of the list I work on in literary studies, I mostly work on 20th and 21st century global literature. In part, this is based on the existing strengths of the list when I inherited, and also how it aligns with other lists at Columbia. I've tried to develop a list that could speak to how literature as literature speaks to and allows us to think through various contemporary global concerns, as well as literature has been shaped by various cultural, political, historical, technological, and economic forces. Obviously, this is not to say that other areas outside of 20th and 21st century literary studies don't do this. Of course they do. But this has become an area for me that has allowed for books on a list that could focus on the aesthetic and formal qualities of literature and how, at the same time, literature reflects and shapes larger forces in the culture. Beyond subject matter or topics, over time, lists develop a certain personality or feel that encompasses different, but not unlimited approaches and methodologies. I think it's important for a list to distinguish itself and have a kind of identity, but should also be open to various and perhaps even competing viewpoints. I publish authors whose works, in some ways are the opposite sides of methodological or critical debates, but still makes sense on the Columbia list. At least I hope so. It's been important for me for this kind of debate within a list and to be open to constantly question and push on the characteristics of my list while still focused on a core set of questions and problems. As Lindsay mentioned, I think too, increasingly, having authors who are kind of engaged with the texts or the books that they're discussing in a way that's both as a critic, scholar, and two, as a reader and a fan, I think is really helpful. We recently started a list at Columbia University Press called the Rereadings List, and that's very much kind of asking scholars to kind of think about a particular novel very much as a reader and a scholar. In terms of the more practical questions that I grapple with at my work and the challenges, I would say it's important that there is a greater sense of sharing of information about the challenges that university presses are up against. These challenges should be confronted together by editors and scholars, and this can happen if publishers and scholars in the humanities have a better sense of each other's expectations and capabilities. So I think, a panel like this is actually extremely helpful in that light. Ultimately, the success and presence of the humanities, both within the academy and the larger culture, is dependent, I think, on a vibrant publishing in the humanities by university presses who ensure the sharing and distribution of ideas and knowledge to readers. I think this is already happening. University presses are publishing exciting and ambitious work in the humanities. Right now, a lot of university presses are releasing their fall catalogs, and if you look through it, you'll see like a whole slew of amazing titles from Princeton and Minnesota. And whenever I go to MLA, there's always this kind of sense of doom when you first get there, but then after you spend a few days on the floor, it's always great. And part of that is because you see all these amazing works and you see and hear the enthusiasm of your colleagues. As an editor at a mission-driven nonprofit organization, publishing single-author monographs aimed at a particular field will continue to be a core part of what I do. I hope the books I publish fuel this field, the fields that I'm working in, and inform future scholarship. But going forward, I think trying to find those works that can speak more broadly, to the field or looking beyond the academy will be increasingly important. I don't necessarily think this is a problem with authors, use of language. There's a whole kind of cottage industry making fun of academic writing that I think, is really just a small part of the problem. I think it's a question of, pushing myself and pushing authors to think more clearly about what are the questions they're asking and why they matter to a whole range of different readers. As has been alluded to by Doug, another problem I think too is the growing dominance and celebration of knowledge that could be quantified and datafied, which in some ways can be seen as contrary to the humanities. I think books in the humanities need to both offer an alternative and even resistance to this, but at the same time, I think it should be open to drawing on some of these methods and techniques that we're seeing in other disciplines to, answer problems in a variety of different areas, whether it's, literature itself, but also questions of social inequality or the environment. I realize there's a kind of wishy-washiness about what I've said here, but I do think, I tend to think of it more as a kind of flexibility. And I think this kind of flexibility in the kinds of books we publish, how we publish, and our willingness to build bridges among different methods, viewpoints, and readers to enrich conversations is really kind of what the future and hope will be for University Press publishing.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Extremely comprehensive sense of things where we are now. Anne, can we turn to you?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm so honored to be in the company of my esteemed peers, and I probably will echo, and I think Philip and Doug have said much of have hit on a lot of central points, and so I'll just try to add to it as best I can, and then we can move to Lindsay's questions. I've worked in university press publishing for about 19 years, first briefly at Oxford University Press and then at Princeton since 2004. And when I came to Princeton, I was initially the reference editor handling large projects like the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, the most recent edition, the Dictionary of Untranslatables, and most recently Information, a Historical Companion. And since 2014, I've been the editor for literary studies. But before all of that, I worked in commercial publishing for about 15 years, including 11 years at St. Martin's Press. And so I've been on both sides of the trade and the university press divide. And I can say that university press publishing has so much to recommend it. It works in a very different way from trade publishing, as may be obvious. But I think, editors at every press are responsible for acquiring and developing books, but beyond that, the process at a university press involves a much larger network, I think. Trade publishers, trade editors tend to cultivate relationships with literary agents and work almost exclusively through them. And a university press editor really requires not only their own, intellectual curiosity, wide reading, activity on whatever networks they cultivate, whether it's on Twitter or, various journals or many of the other sources that Philip and Doug mentioned, but also just through, building and, never ending, building a network of scholars. I do that in normal times through a lot of campus travel as well as conference travel, meeting with as many people as I can in various departments, departments at various institutions, hearing what they're working on, listening to their ideas and recommendations. And it's not always just to find a specific book. Certainly there are people that I identify as people working on projects that I may be interested in for Princeton, but I'm also just interested in meeting people to find out, what their sense of the field is, what's going on in their department, things that they might see emerging. And those people might become authors, they might become readers, peer reviewers for us, they might just become trusted advisors. But, as editors, we're not academics ourselves, we're academic adjacent, and we have a particular expertise in bringing a book to the world. And we depend on all of the scholars, both authors and all of the others who contribute to making a book, an idea, a reality. So, peer review is essential. It's central to the university press acquisitions process. And of course, choosing appropriate peer reviewers and working with an author to evaluate and address those comments are essential and can do a great deal to strengthen a book. The question of how an editor kind of builds a list, makes a mark, certainly personal interest is a big part of it. As others said, if we're not excited about a project, it's very hard to convey that excitement to the rest of the press, because the editor is the link, they're the liaison between the author and everyone else at the press. So we're the advocate for the book all the way through the very early stages, through the production process and through the publication process. We also have to consider, or do consider, the legacy of the press, the current aims of the press across disciplines, and how the book might fit in not only to our own list, but to the other humanities disciplines. For example, at Princeton, we do a lot of sort of cross-disciplinary promotion. If I have a book on literary history, it's likely to also be featured in the history catalog, and we look for ways to sort of cross-promote. And list balance, which Philip mentioned, is also very important. All of the editors at Princeton are expected to acquire a mix of, books for a general audience, or trade books, as we classify them, monographs, more specialized academic books, and also books that sort of are in between. We call it academic trade, but books where the core audience is academic, but because of the author profile or the subject matter or some other factor, we expect that it will get interest beyond the academy, either in review attention or serious interest from serious readers outside the academic community. So, each of us publishes roughly 20 books a year, but only a portion of those will be monographs. So we need to be, we're generally very selective in what we send out for review, and we need to think about not just the intellectual value of the book itself, because we see many, many very worthy proposals, but thinking about, sort of what impact it's ultimately going to make on the field, on our list, and ultimately to the world at large. So is this, if it's an academic book that's more specialized, is this a book that's going to get wide engagement? Will people feel that it's a must read? Is it likely to win awards? We want this book to be in print for many years after not only to get pick up and get interest in the first year of publication, but many years down the road. We're looking for enduring projects. So, every editor, of course, chooses to go forward with a book, not on their own, but with the sort of buy-in from their colleagues at the press. But we try to choose books that are really exciting, that tell us something new or in a different way, that represent a part of the field that maybe is underserved or underappreciated, or has brought something new to light. There are many, many reasons we might publish a book, but I think they have to really stand out from the rest and make an impact at whatever level they're aimed at. I do think that writing is important, and I do really push authors not to make their writing sort of trade friendly if they're writing a monograph, but to be, to write in as accessible a way as possible. I know that not everyone agrees with that approach, but I think at least the introduction and conclusion need to be, I think comprehensible to to their typical reader, and not be sort of deliberately obscure, or even just sort of using academic language as a bit of a shorthand that isn't always necessary. So I guess I'll conclude here. There's lots more to say, but I guess I'll say that academic publishing is an industry that's kind of full of introverts who by necessity have to be very social. Publishing as a business generally is a pretty social business that depends a lot on personal relationships, recommendations, networks, and it's an extremely exciting area. And despite all of the concern about the decline of the humanities and the various struggles that many departments at many universities are having, I think all of us are speaking to the continued vitality of academic publishing. I know that I'm fortunate at Princeton to not, we're not dependent on the university for funding. We're in a better position than some university presses in that respect. But I think every university press that's active, and especially those publishing in literary studies, are really genuinely committed to the mission and want to bring the field the best possible books. And I think that's encouraging regardless of what else is going on. So I'll stop there and we can discuss further. Thank you.
Nice.
Thanks very much to each of you, all of you. We have some time, so perhaps some of you have things to say to the other, or topics you'd like to pick up on, or questions you'd like to return to before we find some questions from the audience. Lindsay.
Okay, I thought of a couple of things that I was thinking about saying. One thing that was really interesting to me is I was talking about people who have trained me. I think things I learned from the Minnesota Press, and I learned things other places too. And two of the people, well, there were at the Harvard Press. I learned a lot from But there are all these resources that most universities have. Some really interesting people. Some of them have been around for a while, whom maybe the world doesn't know about, but on a campus that might be known. At Minnesota, we had a fantastic agricultural economics department. We had two departments of economics, one econ and one agricultural economics. And there was a guy, Doug, is he still alive? Phil Raup? He very possibly isn't.
I don't think so, but I'm not sure.
But he was on our board, and he came to every single meeting, and he was a wise person. So how do you find the wise people who can help you do your mission and fulfill your mission? So I remember, I can think of some things that Phil Raup told the board at Minnesota that were very useful. I think also of people that were available through on the Harvard Board of Syndics, and Harvard faculty, Nathan Glazer and Daniel Bell and Simon Schama. These are people who, now it was always irritating at every meeting of the Board of Syndics to have to listen to Daniel Bell tell us how we should retitle 2 or 3 of the books. But he was really good with titles. We didn't need to follow all of his ideas. He had been a publisher, and Nat Glazer had been a publisher too. He had been a lowly publisher at Free Press, I think. But these are people that were exceedingly valuable to us. There was some other. There's another question that I was talking about with Beauvais, which I didn't talk about today, and that is why did I focus so much on literature at Minnesota, but then seemed to focus a lot more on philosophy at Harvard. I think I've focused on both of those fields, but it may be more conspicuous to the world that I did more literature at Minnesota. Anyway, one of the things that I learned in working with these authors is that the philosophers, it was very helpful because philosophy was so different than literary studies. In philosophy, it was like a mark against you if you published a book. Why couldn't you control yourself? The most desirable form of publication is an article. Now, deans and provosts at various schools are trying to fight against this, and they're probably going to win and force everybody to write books. But it was very healthy to have a bunch of philosophers urging me not to publish philosophy books. And one of the advantages of that was that if you did find a philosophy book, it probably needed to be published. It was more likely to be because the field was against you doing it, and it was against the scholar doing it. So that's a little point. I
think I'll just say, I think Lindsay makes an interesting point about how you find the people on your campus or elsewhere who can sort of, guide you and who can be, good advisors or good board members or, people whose programs are interesting. And like everything else, it's a form of network building. Also a lot of times you can use the peer review process as sort of a trial to find out how someone thinks. When there's someone on your campus that you think, might be a good advisor, having them do a couple of peer reviews if they're willing, gives you sort of a sense of what kind of reader they are and what kind of advisor they'd be. And beyond that, just asking people, regularly who you have worked with, who, this new person came onto this department. What do you know about them? A lot of it is just the same networking that we do when we're acquiring books.
Let me add something here, a little bit of Harvard Press gossip, which is that, so over a long decades, the press editors and management have discovered that some faculty members are more valuable than other faculty members, and so more valuable to have on our board of syndics. Well, we've had hostile takeover at the Harvard Press, and they're firing all the syndics. And they're not calling it firing, but they're moving them all off. And that means all these people who have been carefully cultivated because they're wise and they don't give you advice you don't need. You know, some faculty members are much more useful helping a publisher than others. Well, we're going to get rid of all those people. So it's going to make life easier for the competition, I think. So it's not going to be good for Harvard Press.
That's interesting.
I should stop complaining about that, but it's.
No, that's surprising. And I don't know if people generally know, like different presses have different editorial board, you know, makeups. Like we have a relatively small board. It's six Princeton faculty members, 2 each in humanities, social sciences, and sciences, because our list encompasses all of those areas. And each member serves a 5-year term. And then, you know, one person rotates off each year. But, you know, other presses have much larger boards. They might, you know, ours meets once a month, some others meet more often. But yeah, I mean, I think each editorial board member, you know, you never quite know how you know, some have a really good sense of the sort of collaboration between a press and the board and sort of the function of each, and some, you know, feel that because they're excellent scholars, they're also, you know, publishers, and sometimes their advice on that score is really not as helpful as it might be, but others are fantastic resources. And so, yeah, it's a real, and it's a process because you have people rotating on and off every year. So, you know, some years it's a, you know, fantastic board, and other times there's some rocky moments, especially with newer board members. Yeah, so it's interesting that you said that about Harvard.
Yeah, I mean, Columbia, it's the same. I mean, I you know, different boards have very different kinds of personalities, and, you know, we always meet kind of the week before and kind of, you know, sort of strategize how we're going to present our projects. And, you know, we have to kind of keep in mind, you know, what the board might say about a particular book. But I also think, you know, those faculty boards, I mean, that too is a very good opportunity for presses to kind of let scholars know what it is we do, when we try and be sort of as transparent as possible, and sort of give them a sense of how we decide on what books we decide to pursue.
There's a danger. Simon Schamo is so interesting. He is so eloquent. And sometimes he would come to a meeting and he had decided the book should not be published. And he would give such an eloquent statement about why it shouldn't be published that other people on the board would say, well, but Simon, we should publish it, given that if it says the things that you say it says. And he said, no, I mean for you, you misunderstand me. That was really funny, and it happened more than once.
We have a couple of questions. Would you be willing to have them?
Please.
There's
Sure.
one on the Q&A from one of our Boundary 2 friends and colleagues, Becker Seguin, who asks, you may be able to see this yourself, but I'll read it in case. He asks, what is a book that one of your colleagues at another press has published that you would have loved to have published yourself? He follows that up with this question. What is it about that book, the author, the methodology, etc., that would have attracted you to it, that attracts you to it? Anybody like to take that up?
Since I've been in this job for a while, I've got quite a few in that category. Somebody else should talk. They're books I lost because I was foolishly didn't pursue it well enough.
Lindsay, I was envious of your new literary history of the American literary history, because it was such a, I loved it. At the time I was the reference editor, and it just sort of.
You mean my Rolling Stone Guide to American Literature?
No, the new literary history of.
I called it the.
You called it the Rolling Stone, yeah. No, because it was a reference book, but it was a reading book as well. And I mean, when I first was doing reference books at Princeton, I think there was the sense that they weren't, well, as Peter Doherty used to call them books, like they weren't books that you would want to read. Like reference books had this image of sort of being dry and whatever. And I was trying to do something different. And I just thought that book really encapsulated a certain approach to reference that was really, that book sold as a trade book,
as I said, the principle of that goes back to Minnesota.
Right.
That's the Minnesota studies in the fall. Minnesota, what's it called, Doug? The
Studies on the philosophy of history. No,
no, it's the Minnesota pamphlets on American literature.
That's it exactly.
And each one of them had to be read. The files. Well, I looked at some of the files for that. The editors really pushed those authors, and sometimes the article somebody would send in, and this happened with the Marcus Solar's book too. We'd get entries that were fantastic, but they were 5 times as long as they should. And can't you make an exception for me? No, it has to come in at 6 printed pages. But I could see William Van O'Connor and the other people in the files at the University of Minnesota Press having these tear-stained letters from the authors saying, and they had but it's the same principle that you liked about that, I think, Anne, the readable, very readable stuff.
Right, but that can convey, and each person sort of focused on a particular moment in literary history, but that could convey, something about a topic and why it was important, but wrote and it was coherent, and yet each contributor sort of had their own voice, and I just thought it succeeded very well on all of those scores.
A book I would name that I really. A book I would name that I really admired from another press. It's actually a Princeton book, Paula Rabinowitz's American Pulp, her study of just sort of the rise of, the form of pulps and of, moving classics and other books into the mainstream through this form, which eventually got popular enough that it was censored. That it's sort of, how popularity and attention brings with itself, this sort of other side of, repression. And it's just a totally fascinating book and deeply, deeply archival. So, tremendous book.
I've heard in your comments on both of these books that you're returning to somehow, excuse me, you're thinking about the problem of the monograph in each of your takes on the book that you didn't publish but would like to have published. Anything else on this question? If not, there's another.
A book I wanted to publish but didn't publish was Primate Visions by Donna Haraway. And that was what happened. I think it was in the review process. It was so weird. In the review process, the book got shut down, but even after the press said, and I was forced to turn this book down, some of the members of our board of syndics at various public other scholarly meetings talked about what a wonderful book this was. And I got a chance I felt totally humiliated because I lost that book. But there are more books in that category, books I lost.
The other question that's outstanding at the moment is in the chat, and it emerges from a kind of general question that you see a lot on Twitter and elsewhere nowadays, which is, I'll call it loosely, the open access question, which has part of its universe the objection to people like you, or even me in a different way, as gatekeepers. And so this question appeared at the time when you were all beginning a conversation about boards and syndics and faculty colleagues and so on. And the question comes up under the phrase gatekeeping the gatekeepers, right? So I don't know how you all feel about these pressures to be open access all the time. As a journal editor whose journal is behind the University Press paywall, I have to think about this question all the time, and I get lots of hostile responses from people who can't read things online that we've published. Do you have any thought about this? Does it matter to you? Do you concern yourselves about the role as gatekeepers that you play? Others listening, particularly younger colleagues, might hear your conversation about the networks that you build and the conversations you have and the faculty colleagues you seek out. They might hear the talk about those networks and wonder how to get into those networks, how to break through them, how to get attention for themselves. This is a kind of question which, as a journal editor, I always get. Does this strike a note with any of you?
I mean, we have a foot in the open access side through the Manifold platform, and we publish not a large number of books, but a regular number of projects every year that are open. And for us, anyway, it just comes back to what is an author really trying to achieve with their work. If open access is important for an author, if that's or a networked or a media-rich form, we try and find a way to do that. Generally speaking, open access, requires funding, and we try and work that out and negotiate it. But it just all comes down to, what are an author's desires? And even when you look at some of the surveys that have been done of faculty by Ithaca, for instance, you very quickly see that it isn't that while there are some people who believe very much in open text, there are a lot of people who don't or are even hostile to it. So it all comes down to seeing what the authors are trying to achieve.
For many people, the mere existence of an editor, of course, is the existence of a gatekeeper, and the editor is an antagonist to the idea of openness, and to some people's minds, either an anarchistic or a democratic position. Philip, you were about to say something?
Anne, I think you were about to.
No, go ahead.
In terms of open access, Columbia doesn't really have a program for that. And the notion of, editors as gatekeepers, that's something, I'm kind of acutely aware of, and too, I think over the past year have become more so. And, that sort of getting back to what we were talking about earlier, you just sort of have to be mindful of always trying to expand your network. And I think when you're doing peer reviews, to be honest, if I wanted to get a book through without too much trouble, I could probably pick, 2 readers that can kind of pave the way more easily. But, the point of the peer review process is really to improve the book. That's the real key. And, an editor, once they get to that point, they really want the book to do well. So they can sort of work with the author to figure out what the criticism might be, and how can we sort of solve these questions that a reviewer might be asking. But I think that's really important in opening the gates more widely. Who are you asking to peer review the projects that you're working on?
Yeah, we're actually starting a kind of formal analysis of our peer review roster, and taking really making an effort to expand both the people we asked to peer review in terms of gender, in terms of race, and just making sure that we're not because when I talk about building a network, I'm thinking of like the ever expanding network and not just sort of going to the same old people. Certainly there are people who have been advisors to the press for many years, or people that we've established good working relationships with, but there are also, a lot of other people, younger people at universities that we don't regularly visit, but that we can seek out at conferences or visit. But yeah, I think we're really aware that, while peer review is an essential part of university press publishing, and I don't think that's going to change, and there is a certain amount of gatekeeping, it's not just one person's individual taste. But we do have a responsibility to make sure that the peer reviewers that we choose are the right reviewers for this project, and that will improve it in many ways, not just in its presentation, but, is it using sources that represent the necessary skill. It's a big question, and it's one that I think a lot of presses are even more acutely aware of, as Philip said, after events of the past years.
Well, as Anne and Philip both mentioned, improve, and here is the editor's function. Here is what the editors do. It's working with authors to really improve their books, to refine them, and it's very few books that come into one of our presses in the same shape that they'll be when they're published. You can publish a book around the so-called gatekeepers, but the gatekeepers are also the people who are, consulting readers and consulting the board and consulting their colleagues and reading and advising people on how to make a book succeed. And so the book is transformed through the process. And if that's what you want from your publisher, then you want, one of those gatekeepers. If you really just want to publish the text as it exists, there are a lot of options to do that.
One reason we were thinking about asking you all to talk about the intellectual function of the editor is to remind the world that there is an intellectual expertise in the work of the editor. Those of us who've published books, benefited enormously from that. We're running out of time, but there are two more questions, which if you'll allow, I'll compress them into one, more or less. We had agreed that, excuse me, that this would not be a practicum on publication. But there are two questions here that sort of cry out, and they move along those lines. You can take them up if you like as one. One is how does an author, given all the variety of all you've said and the interests you have and your presses have, how does a young author with perhaps a first book go about finding the proper press and the proper editor? That seems to me always an important question at any stage of one's career. And the second version of that question is, what advice would you give an early career academic trying to publish that first manuscript? What mistake is common when a young author tries to find the proper publisher or the proper editor? Would you like to take those up?
Well, I think, no, go ahead, Anna.
It's not that we're dumbfounded by these questions. It's just that they're common and, very good questions. As far as finding the right editor, think about, I would say, look at, many publishers have much better websites than they had even 5 or 6 years ago. And there's usually a lot of information about the editors in your field, but also, ask your advisors, ask your colleagues, where they've published recently. No doubt in your particular subfield, there are certain presses that, are doing a lot in your area, and that you would like to, look at what they've published recently, not just what they published, 30 years ago. And, is this company that you'd like to be in? Take the opportunity to meet with editors when you have it, either at a conference, when those resume in person, or, there are meetings happening at virtual conferences as well. But, write a good proposal. That's when you do start approaching presses. It's a professional endeavor. I think that the thing that I'm mostly struck by is, I often get proposals or letters that just seem to be very sort of casual, or not really thinking about who they're writing to, or it's addressed to someone at a different press or something. But just take the care that you would in applying for a job, or take it seriously, because you'll usually have one chance, and it's easier often to say no than to say yes. So I don't know, I'll let others speak.
Another thing that young scholars might be advised to realize is that editors need to have books. Editors have a sense, an intuitive sense, perhaps, not the scholar sense, but of what it would take to get a book into more publishable form. And they might be, if they looks interesting, an editor might be willing to help you reshape a book to make it more acceptable to that publisher, but also more sellable and more interesting to the world, more likely to win you higher esteem from your colleagues. So the editors can be a free, it's not free, but that is, you'll pay for it if you take that advice. But if you get the editor involved in helping you think about, because a lot of times authors have, they have something that's interesting, but they haven't even begun to think about how to shape a book so that it could be of interest to the world. I had this father-in-law who was a mining engineer, and he said that in any piece of concrete for sidewalks in New York City or in Minneapolis, there is silver and gold in there if you know how to get it out, how to extract it. And silver and gold can be extracted from every dissertation, and that is almost every dissertation can be turned into something that is more, but can really be a professional advice that a publisher could give and might be very happy to give you. Might take years for that book to ever be reshaped, but I'm thinking about one right now. A book about jokes by a really good philosopher at the University of Chicago, and I gave him a ton of advice, and about 20 years later, the book came out.
I noticed we've run past the time that we promised everyone we would stop. So I'll leave you with advice from a visitor to the group, a very famous novelist, Nuruddin Farah, who says to you all as editors that book covers of university press books don't catch people's eyes when they're in the bookstore looking around.
Oh, goodness.
So
never heard that before.
If you want to speak to your designers based on the opinion of a world famous best-selling novelist. There you have.
Pretty big generalization, I'd have to say.
Yeah, I have no stake in this one. This is all up to you. Anyway, thank you all so much, and thank you everyone for coming. And I just extraordinarily pleased and happy. I'm glad we've done this, and I'm really wish we could have done more and gone on for a much longer time. There are thank yous coming in on the text messages you see too. So thank you all very much again. I hope we can do something more. I've learned a lot. I've seen.
You've got a recording of this, so.
And I will have a recording, and when it's edited properly, it will appear on the V2 YouTube channel.
Okay.
And we will make that link widely available. I hope we can all stay in touch, and I thank you again very much. I'm going to click us out of this, if that's okay with you.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, and thank you, and goodbye to everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, and who came? Paul